have a regional leader, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent, the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves, reaching out and advising that the rhetoric should be toned down and that we should be reducing tension and, of course, relying on diplomacy. We know that we have former ministers like Winston Dukaran and, of course, our own Senator, the Honorable Dr. Amory Brown, who gave the same advice. So this has nothing to do about, of course, some people feel that when you raise these matters that you want to embarrass the government. That's not the issue. The issue, it is about prudence and, of course, responsibility. I think it is fair to say that 1 week has passed and we have not, subject to correction, heard anything from the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs. And why has over 1 week passed without the ambassador of Venezuela being brought in for direct exchanges of information and collaboration to understand what exactly has transpired? I mean, we have heard the comments from President Maduro that a Trinidadian and Tobagonian has been arrested in relation to matters related to terrorism. But the truth is, it is not all that difficult in a diplomatic sense to simply ask for clarification, ask for particulars. I mean, we have an embassy in Venezuela, and of course, as I said, you have an ambassador from Venezuela here in Trinidad and Tobago. So the question arises, of course, as to whether we have dispatched any diplomatic notes. Why have we not briefed CARICOM and explained our position and solicited support if required by our CARICOM colleagues? As a responsible opposition, we will continue to raise our voices when necessary, with prudence, with patriotism, and with a clear understanding of Trinidad and Tobago's strong reputation as a leader in diplomacy. I hope that the government would use this week to do far better in this matter than they have done for the last week. It is our economic and national security interest that tensions be reduced, and this situation must be properly handled. As it relates to the issue on violence in schools, the People's National Movement was justifiably concerned when the Prime Minister, in what can only be described as a knee-jerk reaction, proffered expulsion and jailing of students as the solution to school violence. The Prime Minister, it was seemed, is not aware of the fact, at least based on her discussions, that school violence are routinely reported to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and are already punishable by expulsion. School violence is an intractable problem in Trinidad and Tobago, and it has been labeled as a crisis since 1988, which is almost some 40 years ago. TNT recorded its first only student murder at a school, a tragedy no one wants to see repeated. It is clear that violent students must either be rehabilitated or removed from the school system. In terms of rehabilitation, we know that between the period 2022 and 2025, positive trends in school violence reduction were observed through measures put in place in terms of the Ministry of Education, at that time the Honorable Minister of Education, the Honorable Nyan Gadsby-Dolly, and of course through policies and programs at that time from the Ministry of Education. The multi-pronged approach was a work in progress and was focused on schools with the highest levels of violence. Where rehabilitation efforts failed or infractions committed was too serious, of course we know very well that students faced expulsion. Where a partnership with CERVAL was established to absorb the expelled students or those at risk of expulsion so they would have a chance, of course, at reform, what we would say in a different environment. The Ministry of Youth Development and National Service also had a role to play, as the rebuilding of youth camps was at an advanced stage. The ministry was also working, as we know, to expand MyLAT and MyPart, and, of course, taking the decision to include girls in those programs. We understood that these initiatives would have provided additional outlets for youths who needed to be removed from the mainstream school environment to have a chance, of course, at rehabilitation as well as transformation. Now, notwithstanding the seriousness of this matter, we are of the view that with no mention of the UNC's plan for youth, no empathy, no deep consideration, the Prime Minister, the Honourable Prime Minister, has recommended expulsion and jail. Even if a student must be expelled, there are resources the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago can employ for the issue of rehabilitation. As the Honourable Prime Minister said, whether you are an observer, whether you are an active participant, whether you are a victim, whether you are the perpetrator, whether you may or may not have been inciting, all those categories of persons, from what the Honourable Prime Minister said, it seems as though all those persons will be attracting some form of jail or expulsion. So that the question that we are putting to this government is, what is your plan for reducing school violence? What is your plan for youth development? And we, of course, call on the Honourable Minister of Education as well as the Honourable Minister of Youth Development to speak on these matters. You are the government and you must account to the people who put you there. The third item, as I indicated, is the issue of firing. It has come to our attention that in several ministries, people are reporting, because we have now established a hotline for persons to call. So we are getting information that is important to us as it relates to those decisions, because we know in the public domain that the mantra of the UNC has been, when the UNC wins, everybody wins. And we have had information coming to our attention from several quarters where a number of persons have been fired and, of course, beginning to panic that this may very well be the practice of the United National Congress. I now open the floor for any comments or questions.
I'm going to sort of introduce an associated topic,
Sure.
which is the issue of the signing of contracts, which was raised by both Barry Padarat and Minister Hussein. Signing of contracts within a 2-week period, and some actually on the day of the election, in both CPEP and in the reforestation program. The PNM has not addressed that specific charge. And, well, I asked the question because I know that in the past, the PNM has made a lot of noise about, changes done close to the election, for example, with the .14 contract,
Yes.
clauses were taken out just weeks before, and the EMBD contracts being signed and money being dispensed just on the eve of the election. So I can get an answer to
Sure,
that.
sure. So specifically as it relates to CPEP and, of course, reforestation, we do have the former minister that was responsible for local government and for both those issues relating to CPEP and reforestation. So I'll invite Senator the Honourable Faris Alwan to respond.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen of the media, leader of the opposition. Thank you for your question, Ria. So let's get down to some facts and then some distinguishing features between those things that you raised in comparison versus what we're dealing with today. You will note that I put out a press release entitled Mass Firings. That is a release which touched the issue. The Leader of the Opposition has just informed of a more granular level of firings, dismissals, and I'll add non-contract renewals. So I'll come to that in just a moment, just putting it on the table for now. Specifically, I've had the opportunity to revisit the statements made by the Leader of the Opposition, Minister Padarat, and Minister Hussein. I note that the Leader of the Opposition started off by labeling me in quite a derogatory fashion as the 1%. Sorry, the Prime Minister, previous Leader of the Opposition. Takes a little while to get used to the change, but I confess that I am now guided. The Prime Minister labeled me as the promoter and personification of 1%. I'd like to publicly ask the Prime Minister, what does that mean? Is it in reference to race? Is it in reference to where you come from? Because if it is in reference to economic interest, then I dare say the Honourable Prime Minister should look very close to home, beginning across the platform. I think it unfortunate and distasteful to constantly refer to people in derogatory terms. I'll just say that for now. On the issue of the mass firings press release that we put out, I can confirm as follows. Ministers Padarat and Hussein alleged that contractors at RDC were taking home $45,000 a month. CPEP, there was reference to similar figures. That's not true. At CPEP, the monthly contractor fee, I've double-checked, is $22,000, and that is $21,000 specifically at CPEP. And at the RDC in particular, allow me to give you that correct figure as well. The entire figure for the contractor at RDC is a whopping $4,581.60. So let's start off with the statements made at how exaggerated they are. The RDC forestry program employs approximately 4,700 workers. The vast majority of those workers, a foreman, for instance, tool operator, rehabilitation assistant. A rehabilitation assistant earns $120 a day. Tool operator, $146 a day. A foreman, $165 a day. So amongst the 80 established and then 64 temporary contractors, you're looking at the thousands of persons earning close to minimum wage, just above minimum wage, $120 per day. At CPEP, just for the record, a labourer earns $135 a day. An operator, $145.20 a day. A foreman, $165 a day. There are over 10,700 workers at CPEP and 4,700 workers at forestry. We are informed that the review of these entities, that is forestry and CPEP, is underway. And that review meets with the statements of Minister Padarat. Minister Padarat said that I was taking front, those were his exact words, before the issue of mass firings came forward. Therefore, in my humble view, I interpreted that as a confirmation of mass firings. What has happened so far, as the Leader of the Opposition has put forward, is that there is a fear amongst thousands of persons that they will be out of employment. If you tie that back to the Honourable Prime Minister's statements of being 1%, well, endorsing and encouraging that people that earn $120 a day are safe from firing is certainly a label that one is worthy of carrying to protect the most vulnerable. I can tell you further that my inquiries have confirmed that the issue of the extension of contracts, that is the period of contracts, is a matter squarely for the boards of directors of those companies. The public procurement law requires certain processes to be done for new contracts, and the extension of contracts is a matter that went before those boards, and those boards took steps that they saw in the interest of business continuity, as it was explained to me. I, as Minister then of Rural Development and Local Government, gave no instructions and certainly could not and was not involved in any contract renewals per se. A minister under the law does not extend into those things. A minister's purview for contracts is when a ministry employee, a note is brought forward with respect to the process of interview and hirings, etc. And then after the board that is comprised to do the assessment brings forward, that's when a minister hires somebody, not at a state enterprise, such as CPEP or the Rural Development Company, the Forestry Division. I think it important to also note that the issue of renewals concerned me in terms of inconsistency. I did a simple double check of data on the internet. I note, for instance, that there was a Renuka Singh article of June 3rd, 2016, no contract giveaway. The former line minister in charge of CPEP has denied any wrongdoing in granting of contracts in the days just before September 2015 general election. I can confirm then, if you recall, the election was on the 7th of September. Up to 107 contracts were issued up to the 2nd of September. Stick a pin. The comparison to the variation of liability clauses in the OAS Constructura package was the giveaway of holding a company's bond for insolvency or bankruptcy or winding up mechanisms to the tune of $1 billion. That does not equate to the continuity of business purposes and contracts. All contracts have mechanisms for termination. All contracts have mechanisms for review. Our information is that the government intends to review these things en masse. And the fear that workers have, the thousands of workers have, is that they will just simply be put out of jobs, either by way of reduction of the number of teams that contractors manage, or by way of a cancellation of the program entirely and then a reboot and a reset. Whilst I'm at that, I can also confirm that the government appears to have taken an approach, especially with respect to COVID-19 workers at the RHAs. One RHA alone, 700 workers. Another RHA, 900 workers, to simply not renew persons into their contracts. So the issue of firings is enlarged by non-contract renewals. And therefore the opposition puts the population on notice that thousands of persons, particularly across the lowest paid echelons of CPEP, forestry, and now, if you look to the RHAs, where the direction has been given that there are to be no renewal of contracts for first-time contractors in particular. These are people who are employed, I'm speaking about contract of services and for services, are to be given without direct involvement of the Ministry of Health. And therefore, the message that has come to the opposition by many whistleblowers who are mortally afraid to speak publicly lest they are dealt with by the butchering hand of people is that they are worried about where their next dollar is coming from. If you take this extrapolation to the Office of the Attorney General, I understand that at least several people have been dismissed. So I shouldn't say dismissed, I stand corrected. That they have been summarily brought forward for their contracts to be bought out to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So instead of taking persons and putting them into another area of the Office of the Attorney General, they have been brought forward, told, pack your bags immediately, escorted out by security downstairs, and told, we'll get back to you on the purchase of your contracts. Let me give you an actual example. There is a senator named Brian Bigg. He is one person on the entire Senate bench of the government that does not have a portfolio. Every single person in the Senate there has a portfolio. Senator Baig was employed at the Office of the Attorney General when I was appointed as Attorney General. He was on the AG's floor. Senator Baig continued to work for the Office of the Attorney General uninterrupted for years after I became Attorney General. He moved and he worked in the Intellectual Property Office. There was no firing of Senator Baig for his politics. He appeared in the Senate from time to time. The only time I had an interaction with Senator Baig as to his job was when I saw him in the Senate sitting in the public gallery one day in the middle of working hours. And I said to him, Brian, most respectfully, you have a job. If you're sitting in the Senate, I can understand if there's something that you have to be in attendance for, but a mere visitor to the public gallery does not warrant your attendance. Please find balance. I am telling you about the example that I led. None of the persons that I inherited at the Office of the Attorney General were sent home. My personal secretary when I became Attorney General was the personal secretary of former Attorney General Anand Ramlogan. So you take the Office of the Attorney General, you take the regional health authorities. I can confirm 80 people in a particular regional health authority have already been sent into the void of no employment by non-renewal of their contracts. I can confirm that COVID workers across 2 other RHAs are in jeopardy of non-renewal. I can confirm that CPEP, forestry, are also in view of fear and panic as to where their next steps come from, and therefore we're marking the spot as we did from very early in our occasion to call upon the government to ensure that there is fairness and responsibility, and that people who have political affiliations ought not to be so labeled just because they received a contract at the time a government was in contract period. I mean, we occupied as a government nearly 10 years of office. It surely cannot be that everybody that was hired for the 10 years that we were in office are labeled as PNM and must be sent home and escorted with police down to the door. There ought to be a degree of fairness and transparency in the process. And as more information comes forward, we'll be taking this to the public for. I thank the Leader of the Opposition in particular for raising the issue of the establishment of a hotline for people to call and contact us as to firings, as to constructive dismissals, threats of firings, and as to non-renewal of contracts. Do you have any further questions?
Yeah. I have you there as a former Attorney General, because you would probably have been involved in some of this. Most recently, we saw the NIQUAN judgment. And issues like these have come up right through the PNM's term, where freedom of information requests are denied. It goes to the court, and the court finds the government wanted, well, the then PNM government, in terms of failure to disclose information. It has happened so often that the government prefers to pay, the then PNM government preferred to pay legal fees to prevent the disclosure of information, goes to court, gets slapped down, has to disclose the information, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars later. And on Sunday, we saw Anand Ramlogan name a couple of, these are his cases in WASA, in the NWRHA, Daryl Smith, and so on. What is your position on that? Because that has been a recurring feature over the last 10 years.
Thank you very much for the question. I couldn't speak to the NIQUAN issue directly because I didn't manage it, nor was I involved in it. I have noticed that former Minister of Energy Young spoke to the issue, and I would imagine that he would have better particulars on that. To the general issue of freedom of information, however, you will recall that as Attorney General, I brought forward a process to review the Freedom of Information Act, which was rejected at the Parliament. There was quite a lot of noise by the media in particular to the harmonization for any denial of requests to first come to the Attorney General's office so that the Attorney General could review those objections. And if there was an objection, to then take a step to say, well, look, we'll grant it or not grant it. For myself as Attorney General, For instance, the issue of legal fees. You know, I made a public statement in the Parliament, laid all of the legal fees paid to every single human being at the time that was employed under my hand as Attorney General. So I don't think it's fair to say that the issue under the PNM has just been that, because I am intimately aware of many freedom of information requests that were filed under former governments, including the now sitting government when it was in government. So the issue of freedom of information is one that has to be balanced. I want to remind that the non-disclosure of information at times also concerns whether there may be a prejudice to other aspects of law that are ongoing, criminal investigation, civil investigation. I'm not speaking to the NIQUAN issue in general, but you'll recall that some of those issues, one case in point, the non-disclosure of the CLICO Commission of Inquiry report. It was the Honorable DPP himself that wrote Prime Minister Rowley then to say that under no circumstances should that report be made public because of imminent or contemplated criminal investigation. So there are other aspects to that. On NIQUA, and I think that we can refer those questions to the Minister of Energy, the former Minister of Energy, Minister Young.
Yeah, I understand the NIQUAN thing. Maybe may have fallen under Minister Young. But no, my point was just the general position. I mean, as recently as we've had, for example, the report with respect to the fire that took the life of Lisa Morris, that was not released, even though there was a promise. The TSTT report on the, what do you call it again? The
cyber.
the cyber attack.
Yeah.
And so I'm just saying that if there was a general culture.
Well, after 10 years, I'm sure you could add up a number of matters that may look long. The question is, what are the reasons for those non-disclosures? I couldn't say. I wasn't involved in those matters specifically. I know that there would be reasons, but I want to bear in mind that there are judgments that have to be made as to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act, and one of them is counterbalancing the other actions which may be taking place, criminal or civil proceedings, etc. I don't want to. I accept that 10 years of governance is a long period, and therefore anybody could have a checklist of a number of matters. But if you go back to 20 years over, 5 years prior, they're an equal number. I think it's dangerous to generalize those positions. Suffice it to say that Prime Minister Rowley, when he was Prime Minister, took very unprecedented steps like appearing before special select committees himself to be cross-examined, disclosing matters into the Parliament, took steps of wanting to make disclosures which prosecutorial authorities instructed him that he was. The DPP's words to the Honourable Prime Minister then was that if there was disclosure, that there would be serious consequences. And therefore, a Prime Minister or a Minister would have to be very cautious to receive advice on what is disclosable or what is not disclosable. I don't want to wish to occupy too much time at the microphone until others have finished speaking. May I?
Considering all those things, in many instances.
Yeah, understood. The
favor.
High Court did. There's still the Court of Appeal and there's still the Privy Council. The question is, how far do you want to go? I mean, sometimes it takes a while before a court of final record makes a decision. If you look at the issues outside there are many cases where the High Court will come up with a view that is rejected by the Court of Appeal and the Privy Council, and the law is therefore not settled until an issue has been traversed right up to the final appellate court. And I would think it very careful for us to observe that the High Court is not the court of final appeal. Thank you.
I didn't know. Did anybody else have a question for Senator Alwari, by the way? No? Good. All right. Well, as I said, I raised two other issues in relation to school violence and Venezuela. If there's any, my colleagues are here.
Jesse Ramdale, CNC3. Ms. Robinson, you articulated your position as it pertains to government's handling of the discourse that took place with authorities in Venezuela, right? You indicated that there's need for the collaboration, need to have engaged with the Venezuelan ambassador. What is your position on the Prime Minister's posture? I mean, the warning, as you know in context, the warning came as a result of what officials in Venezuela had put out into their domain as it pertained to this national and, perhaps coming into our territory. What is your position on her posture warning Venezuelan authorities? I know language, the use of deadly force and that kind of thing was bandied about, but her posture, the warning, what do you think it was warranted and necessary? And what would be your handling? How would you have handled the situation in its entirety?
Okay, so as I said, and I mean, I know that Minister Brown, former Minister of CARICOM and Affairs will answer. But the point is this, I mean, here it is, you have a sitting Prime Minister of CARICOM saying tone down. I mean, as a matter of fact, there is also an article in a French newspapers, right, that is giving the impression that tensions have risen between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. No, it's all a question of the geopolitics, right? Because if it is that President Maduro made this statement, I mean, the point is that we know about international relations. We know that there's a reason why you have embassies in countries. There's a reason why you have an ambassador here. So that normally, I mean, I've been at the United Nations for quite a long time, and former Minister Brown was also in Brazil. Yes, and it is not that you may not have these things from time to time, but what it allows you to do is to use the established diplomatic relations. And that's why you have a Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs. That's why you have an embassy in Caracas. So you have the ability to send diplomatic notes. You have the ability to seek out your sitting personnel there who is there specifically for that purpose. And more importantly, when you have diplomatic relations, I mean, we don't have diplomatic relations with every country, but the fact is you do have diplomatic relations with Venezuela. You do have an ambassador here from Venezuela. So that if you want to find out information, that's why you set up the Ministry of CARICOM and Foreign Affairs. And the truth is we haven't really heard. So, I mean, any one of us will be concerned if you hear that kind of statement from President Maduro. So, how do you ensure that when you have a country that's just a couple of miles away, you have a lot of migrants here in Trinidad and Tobago, you know the issue that is being discussed in the public domain, whether it's the gas, and you know that traditionally we have had issues, fishing, we from time to time, you have issues that have come up, smuggling, and all those things, so that you want to ensure that whatever you do, and you send it, and the message and the tone is not only for Trinidad and Tobago, because everybody's looking on for quite a while as to what has been going on in Venezuela. Minister Brown? Sure.
Also, do you think that the UNC's hostile posturing vis-a-vis Venezuela when they were in opposition,
Yes.
Vis-a-vis the Maduro government in particular, for example,
In relation to Guaido, for example.
Yes, exactly.
yes,
Excellent
yes.
example. Right.
Yes.
The fact that
because they took a position very early. But if you
right.
go back, maybe 2010, remember President Maduro was here, right?
Right.
With the UNC, and I mean, for all intents and purposes, at the time, there was a very good relationship. But then, Guaido came and they took a position clearly where they supported
Right.
Guaido. I mean, then we came into office and you had the OAS, you had all those discussions taking place.
Right.
So that I cannot say for sure if that would have influenced. But the truth is, this is the first time that you have heard President Maduro say, listen, we have a Trinidadian that we have that has been arrested, that is in custody in relation to some activity relating to terrorism. Right. So do you use your diplomatic channels and say, well, listen, if you make that kind of statement, you give us the particulars, give us the name, so that we too will be very concerned if you have a Trinidadian that has gone across to Venezuela, because there are consequences both ways.
Right, right,
Yes.
right.
Thank you very much, Leader of the Opposition, colleagues, members of the media, and thank you for the question, which I think Leader of the Opposition has certainly addressed quite comprehensively. The truth is, leadership matters. Leadership makes a difference. And that is why, as leaders, we need to be extremely prudent, particularly our first take and our follow-up reaction on matters that can have grave and severe implications and can leave scars on the relationship between countries, particularly if you're dealing with neighboring countries. So this was an example, really a test of leadership. And as the opposition leader has expressed, it is our hope as a responsible opposition that this week will see a different tone, a different reaction, a different response, a different direction, where the government of Trinidad and Tobago will deploy a more responsible reaction, will deploy the available services of our foreign service officers, the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, will instruct the relevant authorities in Trinidad and Tobago to make the appropriate contacts with counterparts in Caracas and bring this matter out of the realm of rhetoric and tension and into the realm of diplomacy, resolution, and productivity. That's all that we are asking. We're not seeking to embarrass the country or take sides against the country. We're taking sides with the country and with our legacy and history of prudence in the conduct of our diplomatic affairs. We've been tested as a country many times since our independence. There have been many matters that could have resulted in tension. But Trinidad and Tobago has a very strong and proud record. I would say, notwithstanding changes in administration, where our foreign policy has been quite consistent in the general sense. And if you go right now onto the website of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, you will see elucidated the foreign policy of Trinidad and Tobago in black and white. And within that policy, there are many references to our regard for diplomacy and dialogue, for multilateralism, and also for our membership in the non-aligned movement. And that's something else that the Prime Minister's recent comments would have triggered a question as to whether we still ascribe to the principles of the non-aligned movement, which we joined in the year 1970. So there's a lot to unpack. Bear in mind that nationals of Trinidad and Tobago have been arrested, and there have been claims of involvement of our nationals in criminal incidents in other countries, including within CARICOM. I could name some of the islands, and we would have gotten those reports over the years. What would our reaction, a responsible reaction, have been? I can tell you in each and every instance, it would have involved the deployment of appropriate diplomacy, where the Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs at the time would have reached out to his counterpart in St. Lucia, in Antigua, in Grenada, wherever else these matters would arise. When I was ambassador in Brazil, there were a number of nationals of Trinidad and Tobago for various reasons who would have fallen afoul of the law in Brazil, whether in actuality or whether there was an allegation or a claim. But that's why we have, as the Honorable Leader of the Opposition said, that's why we have a foreign service, to deploy, to gain clarity, to access granular detail, which would then be fed into our domestic system, where a proper check can be made, verification can be established, and very quickly, ideally within a matter of days, what can potentially be a flashpoint can easily be reduced. We can avoid an escalation and avoid disturbing our friends like Ralph Gonsalves and others who've now been drawn into the discourse and have been advising this nation to take a more prudent course, particularly with our public utterances in the absence of the type of diplomatic exchange that is expected of a responsible nation like Trinidad and Tobago. So that really has been our message, and you'd have seen former Minister of Foreign Affairs Winston Dukaran, who served under Kamla Persad-Bissessar, also saying, cool down, there's a better route in treating with matters like these. You'd have seen David Abdullah, who's no advocate of the People's National Movement at all. He served under Kamla Persad-Bissessar as well, saying there's a better course, there's a different road. So these are some of the concerns. This is the advice that we have offered. It is my anticipation, in accordance with the what has already been expressed by the leader of the opposition, that this week will be crucial in determining what direction we go in. And you even saw President Maduro himself in his latest missive basically advocating for a more diplomatic resolution of what really is a matter that can arise in the future. This never accused the government of Trinidad and Tobago or the nation of Trinidad and Tobago of any negative involvement. That is what really occurred. And then the reaction was really disproportionate and not conducive to, not in keeping with the legacy of this nation. So those are comments, and if there are any further questions, yes.
Would have emphasized the importance of this week being necessary for timely conversations and dialogue. But this week we've already had, based on this document here, we've seen the Defense Minister and the Homeland Security Minister both meeting with the Charge d'Affaires of the U.S., Ms. Jennifer Niebert, to discuss issues surrounding national security and public safety. It comes, of course, on the eve of what took place last week. While the conversation could be very much par for the course, do you find the timing a bit odd? And is there perhaps a concern when it comes to balance? We're seeing a lot of dialogue with U.S. officials, U.S. authorities, not that much dialogue with our neighbors in Venezuela. Do you find that lack of balance perhaps a bit concerning in the realm of geopolitics?
Well, balance is important and critical. It's a little bit early to come to any sound or complete conclusion with respect to how this government means to conduct its foreign policy. We've had one negative example over the last week with respect to any meeting that you have purported with the United States of America. That's par for the course for Trinidad and Tobago. The United States is our largest trading partner. And in the regular course of business, there would be regular meetings between officials of our government and those of the U.S., those of the European Union, the Canadians. That describes normal business. So I'm not going to read too much into that, but I think the message coming out of your question is the need for balance in the conduct of our foreign affairs and the realization that the relationship, particularly with neighboring countries, is something that we have to take care of. We have a responsibility. And as the leader of the opposition alluded to, it's in our national interest. It's in the interest of our citizens. They are Venezuelan nationals who are living here in Trinidad and Tobago. The government has a right to adjust or change policy in that regard. But while they are here, we have to be very cautious as to the messages we are sending to from official channels. Do we want to feed the prospect of xenophobia or any other challenges? So it's always leadership matters. It's ensuring that we utter prudent messaging. And let me give you an example. I say leadership matters. You recognize the manner in which the leader of the opposition even refers to the prime minister and government ministers, not with any colloquialism, but with respect. There's a reason for that, and it gives a tone and an ethos of responsibility and respect for office. That hasn't always been the case, certainly from the last opposition, but it's another example of leadership shaping culture and producing results. And that's what we are advocating, even when dealing with other countries. So thank you very much.
Before you leave, do you think the government's silence on this matter since the Prime Minister made her statements is a recognition that it overreacted and that it also caused a measure of public panic? Because if you look on social media, people were saying, oh, we only have how many people here and they have so many and their boats are so much bigger than ours and so on.
There's literally a man from Tobago that is saying, take Trinidad, take Trinidad. It's Trinidad's war. We're not involved.
Right, yeah. You saw people saying things like that, and they put in a PNM flag on the door, so when they're ready to attack, I mean, you saw all kinds of things, you know. It became quite a topic of discussion.
It became both a topic of humor, because that's how we handle things.
Right.
But behind that, there is a
The
lot
fear,
of concern.
fear and panic.
Because we,
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Look at the other areas, look at the other.
Right.
Because
You saw a lot of that discussion, the fear and the humor of what happens if Venezuela attacks us with 28 million people and we here with 1.3 million, you know.
Yes. Well,
So, and attached to that, do you think this misstep will have an impact our relations with Venezuela in the short and medium term? And
Well, I would hope that it won't, because we always want the best for Trinidad and Tobago, which is why we keep saying to take a better route, a better course in this matter and engage more prudently. So I took note of the comments you have made and the observations you've shared, that even the ordinary citizens of Trinidad and Tobago have become alarmed and concerned. That really should not have been necessary. And the issue is that the nationals of Trinidad and Tobago care about our country. They recognize that even our fishermen exist and work. Their workplace is not in an office building. It's out there in the ocean, where there is no line in the water delineating a border. And very often, if an engine breaks down, it happens. You cover it in the media. They can find themselves, the natural flow of the current points toward Venezuela very often. And the first thing that happens in such a reality is our Coast Guard officers, who themselves are also concerned, I can tell you, would make seamless contact with their counterparts in Venezuela. And that collaboration is essential for us on both sides of this border. So when anything is occurring or rhetoric is being engaged that will draw us further apart or interrupt that collaboration, there are potentially lives at stake. And I gave the example, every car that's on the street passes in its first instance very close to that border in a container ship or marine vessel. The economy of Trinidad and Tobago is linked to the maintenance of a responsible and productive relationship with this large neighbor. So it has nothing to do with ideology or political connection between parties. That has nothing to do with the prudent line that we certainly have taken in the past. It has to do with our sovereign national interest and a concern for the welfare of all our citizens. Thank you very much.
Dr. Brown, as you're there, I feel like I'm sitting in a university class here because I'm learning a lot from yourself. The minister, the very new minister, is very young. I had a very quick look at his CV that they were putting out when it was election time, and I wasn't really seeing anything that indicated any background in foreign affairs or diplomacy and so on. So I'm always going to say, just as you gave us some insights here and so on, I mean, is it that would you make yourself available if the minister did need some consultation? Because I'm not sure if he had the background.
I'm going to take your question very seriously, and I would let you know that I have, and I haven't shared this before, reached out via senior public officials, public servants in the ministry, and via other channels, contacts that I've had within the United National Congress, to indicate that myself and maybe others would be willing, if there's a word to help settle, etc., in the first stages. We all were new ministers at some point, even Mrs. Beckles was a new minister at some point, but that may not fit into the usual rhythm of the politics of this country. And that's why the fact that other voices have been mobilized, other words of advice, maybe from quarters, from which it might be more easily received, have also come into this space and have provided a consistent message to the government. It is my hope that the new minister, he's still fairly new, will do well and will, rise to the occasion that will always arise in serving Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much.
So, Sean, let me just say that, I served as an ambassador to the United Nations. I was not, foreign affairs was not my area of expertise. But one of the things that you could see clearly in terms of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you have people who have been there for years, so in terms of being able to access technical assistance, in terms of being able to access persons are there, because ministers may change, but in essence, a lot of people who have been there for years that have acquired that skill. And it's not just in the ministry itself, it's in CARICOM. We also have a mission in New York at United Nations. So there is no shortage of access to technical advice or the kinds of expertise that would allow the minister, the ministry, the prime minister to be able to get the kind of information. But the real issue is also the fact I would have made before you came, is that we have an embassy in Caracas. Yes, and we do have an ambassador here from Venezuela. So the critical issue, I think, for members of the public, and I think Ria said it, we are a very creative country. So, you looked at TikTok, and it is as broad as it is wide in terms of people assuming all kinds of things. People, started to show you their equipment, our equipment, their National Guard. So the fact is that sometimes we have to realize that as a country, we look at things through a particular lens, meaning to say, we look at it as though it is a joke, because we have the tendency to do that sometimes. But behind that joke it is a serious affair, and there is always a message. So the fact that Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, who is one of the longest serving prime minister in the country, would say to you, listen, tone it down. That in itself is a message that we must take seriously. We understand the importance of continued diplomatic relations. We understand that it is not just CARICOM, but it's because I said a while ago that you would have seen from France, so that people are all looking, and addressing this issue very seriously. But we are pretty confident that the existing diplomats at the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, at Caracas, as well as the mission, and the mere fact that as it relates to international relations, you have access to people that can clearly give you the advice as to the way forward.
Just wondering, this on the attention, the matter of Venezuela.
Yes.
Should this be something that should be a matter of debate or discussion in Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago? As opposition leaders, that's something that should form an urgent question at the very next sitting of Parliament?
Well, definitely it is something we can raise in terms of a motion on the adjournment. As you know, Parliament has only been the ceremonial opening. Next week is the midterm review. So that, the fact is, if you don't hear anything, it's been a couple of days, and, people are concerned, both locally and internationally and in the region. And my expectation is that there would be some clarification. Definitely, you don't want to leave a matter like that for people to assume what is taking place, especially if you cannot report to us. Listen, we have an embassy in Caracas. We have asked our people, we have sent a diplomatic note to Caracas, and we have asked the president, please give us some particulars so that we know that it is a matter that is continued to engage the attention of the government of Trinidad and Tobago.
What about, let's say, because it seems from the government's position that we are a sovereign state, Trinidad and Tobago that is, and that they have determined there is some threatening language and that they are responding to that threatening language. You said what you said in terms of diplomacy,
yes.
But one wonders, is it when it comes to matters of state like that the government can adopt that position without necessarily a consensus of issues in Parliament, for example. I raise that because I believe in Guyana,
Yes.
where, and subject to any further clarification, where they have a border issue with Venezuela, there is some sort of consensus with the government and opposition on that matter. Well, of course, they disagree on everything else. So one wonders whether such things need specific things like this, whether there should be consensus, or is it just the right of the government to make that determination? There's a threat and they're responding to that.
Yeah, but when you make the determination, you're looking at all the consequences. I mean, the truth is that if you use Guyana and Venezuela as an example, if you recall, I mean, that this has gone to the International Court of Justice, yes, and you also have had CARICOM intervening because you understand the consequences of a situation like that if it is not resolved. And that is not that is an issue going back more than a century as it relates to Guyana. So it has continued. I mean, Essequibo region, and we know the amount of Guyanese that are there, so that if anything happens there, it impacts for us for a multiplicity of reasons, whether it's travel, whether it's the economy, whether it's agriculture, whether it's trade. And then a lot of times they don't separate the regions, because when you think of Guyana, you think of CARICOM. Okay, and we know that issues, that tensions that have been taking place, of course, between Venezuela and the United States. So we cannot pretend that that is an issue that will not impact us in some way. Amy, do you want to add anything? Sure.
Just one very brief comment. And going back to the previous question about the richness of support within the Foreign Service, I think it is worth noting that just over a week ago, the permanent secretary, the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, a veteran of the Foreign Service, was transferred out of that ministry. So I think in response to your question, you would want to note that now you have a new minister, a new parliamentary secretary, and a brand new permanent secretary as well. In addition, a deputy permanent secretary was transferred. So the leadership of the ministry, even from the Foreign Service perspective, has been altered significantly. The timing, etc., and the current silence of the leadership of the ministry and the minister, you may want to look at that as well.
Do you have anything else you want to ask? Yeah, sure.
Heard the government statements, basically that they are not going to be taking a look at persons from Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago of military age or that kind of thing. What is your opposition's take on that particular statement of the government?
So again, I touched on it a little bit earlier. It's really a note of caution, particularly in an era of social media and when we are all aware there are tendencies towards xenophobia in this and other countries. We have to be prudent and responsible in our utterances. And at the early stage when we don't even understand the reality of what would have been transpired and the claims being made from Caracas, to take it at that point and talking about military age, Venezuelan men, it is unnecessary and imprudent, and can create scars that can last a long time and have other implications for the good conduct of our society and the interaction with a neighboring country. So I thought those were very unfortunate and at best very premature comments. I don't.
You can stay just in case, but what I would add to that is the issue of, I mean, traditionally we have been known here as a zone of peace. You see, I mean, I have been at the UN, and that is one of the things that when you talk about this region, about a zone of peace, so that you clearly don't want the impression in some way to be created when you start thinking about that. I mean, what is the world thinking? So if the government does not clarify this situation very soon, having made those kinds of comments, it's no wonder people are going and doing the research in Venezuela and comparing equipment, comparing military, the amount of people that are there in the army. And I mean, you really do not want to go down that road. So as I said, we have had advice from a prime minister who has been there, involved for decades in CARICOM and involved, I mean, even when you had the issue relating to Guyana, and Venezuela, you would have noticed that CARICOM played a critical role, because normally that's the position you bring together the countries. And if you would recall that at some point in time, if we go back and do the research, there was a meeting in Barbados. Okay, I think there was also a meeting in Dominica as well, to deal with it. So clearly, even a situation like that, CARICOM came in and played a role, and we were able to at least, as they would say, cool it down. It's not that it's still not an issue, because from time to time, I mean, if you have gone to the International Court of Justice, and whether or not Venezuela is going to accept the decision is a different matter, because that is not a decision that was made recently. That is a decision that was made almost more than a century ago, if I recall correctly, but it has come up again. And when it comes up again, it means you go back and you look at the whole history and you ask yourself, well, what has happened since? But we know that it's all a question of an economic issue as well, the issue of oil and gas. Yeah. Sure.
You look at the issue of the United States, the relationship Trinidad and Tobago has with the U.S., the issues that the U.S. has with Venezuela. You have the Trinidad and Tobago's relationship with China, of course. There are some who would say, well, China, of course, there may be a strong support from China for Venezuela, that kind of thing. So from a wider foreign policy position, is that something, the issue of balancing, as you had mentioned earlier, that as a small island state, we have to be mindful of not just the relationship we have, let's say, with Venezuela, for example, but those wider implications of relationships with the U.S., with China. And if we adopt a particular position against Venezuela, for example, does that pose the risk of our relationship with other nations, let's say China, for example?
Well, I'd say it's always a balance. I mean, we have been known traditionally to have diplomatic relations with China, with the United States, and I mean, at the same time, we have been a country that has taken a strong position on Cuba. All right? So people have recognized, yes, you are sovereign, and yes, you can have these relationships with China and United States at the same time, and that is not exclusive to Trinidad and Tobago, because you have that in terms of the CARICOM region. China as well, they have their embassy as well here in Trinidad and Tobago. So that we recognize that it would always have to be a balance. As a small country, we have recognized that larger countries have seen the issue of us having good relations, even as a small country, because the role we have played traditionally in terms of not just diplomacy, but the fact that America has been is our largest trading partner, but in relation to issues of methanol, and so that, they are one of our largest importers. So we have had to have that relations because of the whole issue of trade. Yeah, sure.
And thank you, Leader. And I think it's a very good question. I want to say that Trinidad and Tobago has conducted itself in the past very prudently in these matters. The leader referred to the Declaration of Argyll and the fact that CARICOM and CELAC came together to try to calm the tension that was peaking between Venezuela and Guyana. And Trinidad and Tobago was in the room, not throwing hot rhetoric on a flashpoint, but being very prudent in the form of former Prime Minister Keith Rowley and providing advice and crafting and shaping a declaration with mechanisms to reduce tension, not increase them. The other final point I'd like to make in terms of implications for the future, Trinidad and Tobago, certainly when we demitted office, was in the preparatory stages of a campaign with great implications for the United Nations Security Council for a non-permanent seat. So when we make statements about whose government we stand with on this issue or that issue, when we are imprudent in the rhetoric we are putting into the regional and global space, that has potential implications for the success and the shape of our campaign, which certainly we, in our vision, was an opportunity to elevate the country, brand Trinidad and Tobago to a higher standard, and lean on our strong reputation for prudence and responsibility in the conduct of our foreign affairs, where we'd now be sitting at that highest level in the United Nations, making decisions and taking actions to increase peace in the world. So that's something to think about as well.
Yeah, and just to say that very recently St. Vincent became the smallest country in the world to sit in the Security Council. So I guess you can well advise, you can well think about why maybe Honorable Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves so it fits to tell us about, tone it down. So if there are any more questions, I'll take about 2 more questions. Sure.
You said
Yes.
upcoming. You have a new opposition, you are leading, you have a mix of experience, new persons and so on. What would be the strategy of the opposition as you, for example, one of the things you've been, in the campaign for the election, the PNM had been asking the UNC now in government about the issue of funding, where they're going to get the funding for their plans. The government has said they'll find the money, but would that be one of the key things that you'll be trying to get further clarification from the government in terms of that issue, the budget?
I don't know if I want to give you my strategy. No, but I mean, we have to look at what the government said specifically. As it relates to when UNC, everybody wins, we looked at the issue of the property tax, where they indicated, well, you're going to get a refund on the property tax. And then the Honorable Prime Minister said, no, that's not our policy. We looked at what happened as it relates to, Mr. Imbert from time to time in relation to the tax amnesty. You remember every time that came out, it was a big issue. And quietly, I haven't heard much about it in the press. They have extended it to August. Right? And so clearly they understood that that was a policy that was needed. They have given no indication as to why they did it. They simply did it because if I recall correctly, I think we may have taken it up to April or May. I'm not sure exactly what they have taken it to August. And of course, the whole issue of revenue. They made this big issue about the month of May and gave the impression that the revenues had dropped substantially. You would have heard Mr. Imbert on the last week, Tuesday, give an explanation. We heard no response from them as it relates to that. We are waiting to see exactly, because we have seen where the prices on oil and gas has dropped. And therefore, we understand that you're going to have a deficit budget. The truth is, it's not going to be the first time, but that was one of the issues that they harped on every time, deficit budget. So let's see what they are going to be telling us now about the shortage in revenue, and exactly what would be their policies to put in place, whether it is diversification and how they are going to deal with the shortfall. So we are waiting very much, because the drop in oil and gas is not something that, you can anticipate, of course, with the war in Ukraine and many other factors. And we understand from time to time the decision that OPEC takes in relation to this matter. But we will await to see exactly. You tell us how you're going to deal with the issue of the drop in oil and gas, the issue of the revenue, and what are your policies and programs now to deal with these multiplicity of areas that they always complain about, whether it is agriculture, whether it is diversification, whether it is the ease of doing business. But I won't give you my strategy just yet. Yes. Sure.
I know Mr. Imbert is not here.
Yeah, well, he's not here today.
Right. But any thoughts on the criticisms that the Prime Minister has had of the central bank governor, saying that he's refusing to give information about the allocation and distribution of Forex? Any sort of thoughts on that?
Well, I know it's a matter I discussed with former Minister Imbert, and I know he has a particular view on it. I wouldn't want to say it at this point in time, but next week we would have that matter dealt with. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.